Okay, I would like to go over the presentation for week 2 for CP636, the Clinical Exercise Physiology 1, and I'll just go over the major points and try and make it as simple as can be. I just want to say, if you feel that there's a topic that you do not own, that you do not completely understand, please don't hesitate to send an email. You're in school to learn. This is where we make mistakes and learn from them. This is where we accumulate knowledge that we did not have. Every person has different experience and perhaps different ways of explaining things. I focus more on principles. I think that in physiology, understanding the principles and knowing where to use them, apply them, is very, very important. Sometimes more than knowing a specific piece of information. So please, please, please don't hesitate to send me questions or call me on Skype or FaceTime or on the phone and just have things verified. I'll say this 1,000 times. I appreciate more students that ask questions even if they think they're stupid, which there is no such thing as a stupid question, rather than those who don't ask at all. So if you're afraid that someone's going to think that your question is stupid or he shouldn't know, I don't know and understand this, we're not there. That's not where we're coming from, right? And it stays in the family. I mean, I might upload it to Facebook and Twitter, but other than that, it's between us. Alright, straight to the materials. I'm going to kind of leap the first few slides. So we are starting to talk about energy, and we're on slide number 7. And in order to understand the definition of energy, it's a simple definition, and I think that it makes sense in so many ways to define energy as the ability to produce work or outcome. Now, of course, there's a mathematical or / physical definition to work, but in our case, it's some kind of outcome. Some kind of outcome. If the outcome is 0, theoretically, you can say that the work was 0. Okay, but this is kind of playing games with definitions, because when you're working isometrically, the muscles are working, right? I just said it. You're working isometrically, but the movement is 0. So it really depends what outcome are you measuring. So as I wrote, the definition of what is an outcome is a bit tricky, but I think still that the definitions hold. Alright, so we are on slide number 8. Wait a minute, the staple here is giving me a hard time. There we go. We know that energy is never lost, but it changes form. The body uses heat quite a lot, also to heat itself, and because it's easy to mobilize, it's easy to utilize. We also know that when we create movement, 70% of that energy goes to heating the body rather than directly creating movement. So we're inefficient in that way, but it's a necessity because we need to keep our body hot, right? We want it to be about 36.6, 37 degrees Celsius. Obviously, heat is also produced through friction. Friction probably is transformed into heat immediately and most likely. You need to understand something. When we're talking about chemistry, if you remember your basic chemistry and your very first lesson in chemistry, so to speak, what do atoms want? What do substances want, or ions? They want electrons. So we can see electrons as cash in a way. Everyone wants cash, right? So it's transferred from hand to hand, it's immediate, it's easy to use, it's free of taxes. I didn't say that. So electrons are being moved, are being transferred, are accepted, are given according to gradients, and that is one of the major energy forms that the molecules are working with. In that sense, when you look at the periodic table or you look at ions that have a +2 and above charge, they really need those electrons, so they become very reactive. And if they're very reactive, you do not want to leave them alone. So we do not want calcium moving around by itself. We do not want ferrin moving around without a chaperone, and so on and so forth. So these ions have great value because they are reactive, but just remember that if their concentration is too high, they're not controlled and supervised and confined, they're gonna make damage. We do not want them, for instance, in the bloodstream without a chaperone, or not confined into a molecule, and so on and so forth. Okay, what else do we have here? I'm on slide number 10. We just spoke about that. Let's continue. Okay, so we've talked about everything on slide 10 and 11. You have an example regarding calcium and cancer. Calcium is released into the bloodstream at advanced stages of cancer, and one of the reasons for immediate death, or the acceleration of death. All right. What else? We see how ferrin is in the middle of the molecule called hemoglobin, which is the carrier of both oxygen and carbon dioxide, CO2, in the blood. So in the middle of the hem unit, which is the basic building block of the hemoglobin, there's a ferrin atom. Okay. Okay, let's talk about what we call energetic molecules. Energetic molecules have the potential to release energy, right? Or to produce, energy can be produced from them. But I think that release is probably the right word. But they also have to be accessible. I mean, imagine that you have $1 million locked in Fort Knox. How easy do you think it's going to be for you to access those $1 million? It might be easier to have $50 in your pocket, and you'll probably use those $50 faster than you'll use the $1 million. So accessibility of the energy is a major factor when we're talking about utilization of energy. So if you have a molecule that is huge, and it has huge potential for energy, but you're going to have to break it down and break it down some more, and then break it down a bit more. It's going to take a lot of time. And if time is an issue, like we often know, like in sprints or anaerobic all-out bouts, right? Those molecules become irrelevant for the time being. But if you have a prolonged time, if you're running a marathon, you know, you have enough time to mobilize those huge molecules. You have time to break them down. You have time to really utilize their full energetic potential. So small and accessible or highly accessible molecules will be used first. Huge and unaccessible or low level accessibility molecules will be used last. If we look at ATP, ATP is ranked 6th in its energetic potential, but it is by definition what we call the metabolic coin of of the body, and you can see on slide 16 the amount of advantages that this molecule has, and it is called, after all, the international molecule. So everyone uses it as a metabolic coin, and that has a great advantage because when you eat meat, let's say a cow, okay, or a pig, you're actually eating that animal's muscles, right? Think about it. You're eating the skeletal muscles in principle. Those skeletal muscles probably have ATP within them. So you're getting it ready for use, so to speak. Let's see. So we talked about slide 17. Let's check out slides 18. Alright, so basically when we're talking about metabolism, we're talking about, at the very, very bottom line, ATP production and electron transfer. Let's talk a bit about bioenergetics. So we are on slide 20. What the body basically does, if you think about it, it takes chemical or chemically stored energy and produces from it mechanical work, right? So energy turns into movement, for instance. And that's kind of the bottom line of the body's function, if you think about it. Movement is one of the most important principles of nature. If you can't move fast, you need to have other strategies of survival. Movement allows you to run away, escape death. Movement allows you to hunt, and the lack of does not give you the option to both, usually, unless you develop some kind of strategy. So for instance, size can be a factor. When you take a hippo, although hippos are very fast, just so you know, they don't move much, but their size, the size of their teeth, their strength makes them almost impossible to hunt. You can, of course, also become toxic. You can camouflage yourself, and so on and so forth. But basically, those are adaptations to the inability to move. Movement is everything. Let's go into the body. Movement is life. If you do not have gradients, if substances are not moving, if blood is not moving, you have no circulation, you're basically dead. So movement is life, and the body is about movement. Please remember that. And that is, of course, a leading principle in physiology, exercise physiology, and clinical exercise physiology. We need to understand that everything in the body is relating to survival. We've spoken about this. So you cannot detach the principles that we're talking about from the idea of survival. Everything has to kind of check out with the idea of, does this help me survive? If the answer is yes, we're good. If the answer is no, we have a problem. Okay, so moving on. We've talked about movement is life, the lack of movement. Okay. Obviously, we need outcomes to live. We need movement. We need a positive outcome. So units of metabolism will naturally be also units of work, energy, and movement, such as power. right? Uh, um, the cell's optimal goal is to survive. In order to survive, work must be greater than zero. Okay? You can't have a cell producing zero work. That means death. We're on slide 26. Of course, if work has to be greater than zero, by definition, the energy produced has to be bigger than, or greater, sorry, than zero. If energy has to be greater than zero, 99% of the processes are using ATP as its payment source or coin, so ATP has to be greater than zero as well. Okay, we are on slide 28, and we're talking about metabolisms. There's different ways to define metabolism, but they're all connected to the idea of life and living, right? So one can define metabolism as the sum of anabolic and catabolic processes. As we know, anabolic processes take components and build something from it. So it's a building process. In this building process, you store energy. You're investing energy in the process. So the body loses immediate energy, but that energy is not lost. It's simply stored into a molecule. The catabolic process is exactly the opposite. You're breaking something down to its components. You invest energy in the breakdown, but the vast majority of processes, actually, the balance is that you're earning energy. All right. According to that, the livelihood, or how much is an organism alive, is in a linear relationship to the amount of change, meaning breaking down processes, catabolism, and building processes, anabolism, of the cells or of the organism. All right. Let's see. So here's the combination between the units that we've talked about and the idea of utilizing heat to work. Obviously, we can measure the livelihood, or what we call metabolism, of a cell, tissue, organ, system, organism by the amount of heat produced or consumed, and thus the unit of calorie or kilocalorie, or small calorie versus large calorie. Children, for instance, are less efficient energetically, so they spend more energy. A child can spend almost 6 times as much energy as an adult. That's why they can eat almost anything and get away with it. Understand that if you have a fat kid, that kid has to eat so much to be so fat that if an adult would eat the same, the adult will definitely be way fatter or obese. So they are inefficient, and we can say that their metabolic rate is way higher. Let's talk about metabolic pathways. Metabolic pathways are tools of the cell, and of course the body, to produce energy, right? And they are the way to keep us alive, literally, in every aspect that you look at it. The simplest way to define metabolism would be one that affects metabolism, okay? But then every chemical process or pathway in the body would be regarded as a metabolic pathway. So we narrow down the definitions to those who produce ATP, and then it makes it easier because then we only have 3. Okay, 3. All you need to do is know how to count to 3, which you'll meet a lot in exercise physiology, the ability to count to 3. When we look at metabolic pathways, we want to divide them according to 2 characteristics, or main characteristics. A, is oxygen taking part in the process? Meaning, is the pathway aerobic or anaerobic? Aerobic if oxygen takes part, anaerobic if not. And the second thing that we're interested is to see what are the outcomes, what are the metabolites that are produced. So we want to see if lactic acid that afterwards is buffered to lactate is produced or not. If it is produced, that pathway is lactic. If it is not produced, it's alactic. All right, we are on slide 33. A bit of games with the understanding of the terms from Latin to English. You can read this on your own. When we talk about energy production, there are a few rules that apply to metabolic pathways. If you want to understand the usage of metabolic pathways, you have to understand their advantages and disadvantages. Each metabolic pathway is used at the same time. The question is, which one is more dominant, meaning which one right now is the tool of preference in order to produce the majority of the ATP needed at that time. Now, don't go in your mind when you say majority to more than 50%. That does not necessarily apply. You can have one metabolic pathway producing 40%, the other one can produce 35, right? And the third one can produce 25, and you still have 100%. So it's the majority or the highest percentage of energy per pathway. So for instance, if you have a huge molecule, as we've spoken, and it's going to take more reactions to break down that molecule, the energy production is going to be slower. If the outcome is received slower, that is not a good pathway to use when you need the energy fast. For instance, reflexes. For instance, in the use of I forgot the word. Sprints. Any high power outcomes. Okay? When we're talking about aerobic energy production, we're talking about a lot of energy that is received slowly. The advantages, once again, a lot of energy and no lactic acid produced. When we're talking about smaller molecules, you don't necessarily need oxygen to break them down, so the production of energy is fast. But in case of carbohydrates, they're going to produce lactic acid, and the acidity of the environment of the cell and the environment is a limiting factor, as we will learn in the future. So I'm on slide 36. On the other hand, we have a specialization of function in the protein family, and these special proteins, almost super proteins if you want to call it, are called enzymes. And enzymes are able to take any process and speed it up. So if you have more enzymes, or the concentration is higher within a pathway or a cell, then energy production or the outcome, the process itself, is being conducted faster, and more can be achieved in the same amount of time. Okay. So we see the three pathways. The first one is ATP-CP. Some call it CP-ATP. The idea of ATP first in my head is that you always have ATP that has produced in any one of the three pathways that is ready for use, available for use at any given time. When we're talking about CP, creatine phosphate, we do not need oxygen for the process, meaning that it's going to be fast. Since there is no pyruvate included in this process, because we are not breaking down creatine, which is it is a protein, but we're not breaking it down. We're just taking the phosphate from it. We do not have pyruvate produced, so we do not have lactate produced. There's no metabolites, basically. The energy production in absolute units, meaning how many ATPs do we get per unit of substrate, in this case CP, is very low. It's only 1. But this process can be reproduced again and again and again extremely fast. So it's good for instincts, it's good for reflexes, it's good for any immediate short-term power needed. Then we have glycolysis, which anything with SIS at the end is the breakdown, is catabolism. So we're talking about the catabolism, the breakdown of carbohydrates. We have 2 options to break down carbs. If there is oxygen in the area present, we can use that, and that's a preferred option. If not, we can break them down without the presence of oxygen. In case of an aerobic environment, lactate is going to be produced. If the environment is mainly aerobic, there's enough oxygen to break down the carbs, then the process will become aerobic. And accordingly, the outcome, if you're breaking down a carb, let's say glucose, with oxygen, you can get as much as 12 times more, and even 19 times more energy than if you're breaking it down without oxygen. The process has 10 reactions when we're talking about anaerobic glycolysis, and if we're talking about aerobic glycolysis, it has a bit more. The aerobic process obviously works with oxygen. It can break down anything. It produces mainly water, which is called metabolic water, and CO2. The amount of energy produced from every substrate is the highest possible. The process, the time until you get the energy, is relatively long in comparison to between all 3 pathways. Of course, it takes nothing in the body, but it's the longest from all, and it has the most reactions in the pathway. So we have the known numbers of the energetic potential or content of different foods according to their components, and this is kind of non-knowledge, so you can see that carbohydrates will give you roughly 4 kilocalories per gram. This is after any energy invested in the process. Lipids will give you about 9, and proteins about 4.3. Also depends what kind of carb, what kind of lipid, what kind of protein, but these are kind of averages. And once again, these numbers do not necessarily take into consideration the efficiency of the process. But those are kind of finger rule numbers, if you will, to that. At rest, there is a time factor, but it's not as important or critical as during exercise. So things are slowed down, right? Intensity is 0. So we can utilize bigger molecules more than usual, meaning mainly fat. When power, work divided by time, is important, like in sports, for instance, a 100-meter dash. Obviously, you need maximal strength and power and velocity and minimum time to be first. Then time becomes a major issue. The ratio has to be maximized, so we don't have time to break down huge molecules. All right, slide 41. When we look at organs and systems, especially the two that have a pump in them, but you can also apply the same principle to the nervous system. Obviously, a neural pulse has to be received in the target organ on time, so we don't want to miss a beat, right? But if we're talking about the heart and the lungs, the two major pumps of the body, obviously you have to have a minimum amount of work done, accomplished, per minute or per second, or however you want to measure it. No one is alive with 20 beats per minute, right? So you have a minimum that allows a person to be alive. Same thing about the lungs. So in other words, the power has a minimum value that is obviously not 0. And that's what we call the relative 0. So if someone has a heart rate of 60 and beneath that 60, that person will not be able to stay alive. That person's relative 0 in case of heart rate is 60 beats per minute. And you have here examples. Let's continue. So talking about metabolism, it's influenced by age, it's influenced by gender or sex, your level of physical fitness, the time of day, your nutrition, your health status, and much more. So there's a lot of things that are going to influence your metabolism, including, for instance, biogenetic factors. When you are improving metabolism, by definition, if you integrate everything that we've just talked about in the last 33 minutes, you must understand as a professional that by improving metabolism, you are immediately improving life. You are improving life, per se, in the most biological way possible. And we know as a fact that when metabolism is improved, people feel their life has become better, even beyond the chemical or biochemical level or aspect of things. Alright, you shouldn't be surprised then that one of the most immediate and likely adaptations to exercise is improvement of metabolism, and specifically conservation of energy, meaning energetic efficiency. If we're thinking about energetic efficiency, what are we saying actually? We're saying two options. A, I want a bigger outcome with a smaller price or energetic investment. B, even if the outcome is the same, I still want to pay less. So let's say that you decided to buy a television, and you know the model, you know the make, right? And you start looking around in shops. You're not going to buy in the first shop you find, right? You're going to shop around, you're going to compare, you're going to go on the internet, look for that model and make, and compare costs. At the end of the day, you want the same TV, but you want to pay less. So exactly like we would like to save money or be financially efficient, the same thing goes for the body. If the body can find a way to preserve energy, to improve its energetic efficiency, it will go for it. But, and here's the big but, and I'm not talking about the glue, there has to be a good reason. It's not going to happen by itself. Although logically it should have happened by itself, but apparently in order to achieve those adaptations, you have to invest money first. If you're not sure there's a good reason to invest the money, meaning in the body's case, that energy, it's not going to happen. So if you have a stimulus that the body perceives, the brain perceives as worth investing money because the return on the investment will be greater, then it's going to happen. If not, it's not going to happen. Meaning that there has to be a reason for adaptation. You're not adapting without a reason. Remember that. Alright, let's see. Slide 44. Okay, one of the major principles that you should never forget and understand why we constantly are going to visit the cells again and again and again, and you must master the level of the cell, is because the cell is A, the smallest form of life, and B, metabolism is determined by the cell. So for instance, one of the ways that a cell has to prevent energy from leaving, or any substance from leaving, is handcuffing it chemically with phosphates. So phosphate is used as a ball and chain, whereas substances that are valuable to the cell can only enter, they do not leave. So for instance, ATP is one of them. If you think about ATP, you have adenosine with 3 phosphates. It's like a ball and chain on every leg, and then, you know, handcuffs on the hands, just in case. So it's not going anywhere. So if you think about it, about metabolic pathways producing ATP, and ATP meaning life in a way, survival, everything is produced within the cell. In principle, life is sustained at the level of the cell. Now obviously anatomically and functionally we have other levels, but if you have a problem at the level of the cells, obviously it's going to affect the levels above it, and don't forget that. And hey, is it a mere consequence that cell phones became the center of our lives? No, they have a cell in their name. Think about it. If your cell phone is your life, there is a reason. Okay, let's see. So we talked about metabolic pathways. The first metabolic pathway we see that is producing 1 ATP for every reaction, which is the lowest rate that you're going to find between ATP produced and the number of reactions. You can read about it. We already talked about it, and you can see in what slide is that? This is 45, so this should be 46. You can see the reaction that we have 1 ADP is connected with creatine phosphate with the help of an enzyme, CPK. The enzyme is going to take one phosphate, it's going to take the phosphate, from the creatine phosphate and connect it to ADP. ADP has two phosphates. In order to create ATP, we need three phosphates. 2 plus 1 is 3. So what we get is 1 ATP and a free creatine. And you can see that this creatine can be used in several ways. It can be used to build muscles. It can be exerted by urine, and it can be reconnected to another phosphate and be ready as a source for energy production. Alright, we're talking about glycolysis. One of the major ideas that I wrote here, and I hope that it sticks in your mind, because it's a simple idea, is that when you take apart glucose, what you find is 2 units of pyruvate and 4 units of hydrogen. If you play with the order of the same components, you get lactate. So, 2 units of lactate. My mistake. 2 units of lactate. So lactate is 1 pyruvate and 2 hydrogens. Glucose is 2 pyruvates and 4 hydrogens, meaning that every glucose has the potential of creating or producing 2 units of lactate. It's that simple. It's mathematics. So, on the other hand, any substance that has pyruvate in it and hydrogens, which a lot of substances have, a lot of molecules have, has both the potential of producing lactate or glucose. It depends how easy and fast it will be to reassemble them. Take apart the molecule and then reassemble it in a different order to either produce lactate or glucose. Obviously, we would rather produce glucose, right? So you have this idea on slide 48, and you must understand in regards to exercise and metabolism, this principle is utilized on a very wide scale. Okay, poor cat, right? Now we have a very simple idea. If you want to produce energy with oxygen and enjoy the advantages that oxygen withholds, then you must enter the mitochondria within the cell. But the mitochondria has a specific width of an entrance door. If you're wider than the door, you're not coming in. You're getting stuck, right? Exactly like in real life. So that width is limiting molecules that can enter, meaning that what we need to do is break down any molecule that is wider or bigger than the entrance door, so to speak, to the mitochondria. And that would be any molecule with more than 2 carbon atoms in it. So before anything enters the mitochondria, we break it down, make sure that it's a narrow or smaller molecule. Pyruvate has 3 carbon atoms in it, so we have to take it apart. The way to take it apart or break it down a bit is to catabolize it with oxygen. That means that if you're taking pyruvate, that by definition is a carb, and breaking it down with oxygen, you are aerobically catabolizing it, meaning that the breakdown of a carb is glycolysis, with oxygen by definition aerobic glycolysis. Thus, we always say in exercise phys the start of the aerobic metabolic pathway, the first phase is aerobic glycolysis. What we are producing is acetyl-CoA, which has only 2 carbon atoms, and that is allowed now to enter the mitochondria. Any process that is conducted within the cytoplasm of the cell is not going to produce high amounts of energy. But if the same substrate is first catabolized in the cytoplasm and then products of that catabolism enter the mitochondria, any phase now, any additional phase I should say, in the mitochondria is going to produce additional energy to what we produce in the cytoplasm. So we have 2 basic processes or phases within the mitochondria. We have Krebs cycle, which immediately doubles the amount of energy, at least, that we have produced in the cytoplasm. But the major energy production phase is what we call the electron transport phase or corridor, and that is where a lot more ATP is produced to achieve that ratio of between 12 to 19 times more in comparison to the same substrate. But I want to stop and go back. And it is my experience that you would not understand metabolic pathways, energy, exercise, a lot about exercise, if you do not understand the pyruvate junction. So the idea is very simple. A pyruvate has been produced. It doesn't matter from where, it doesn't matter why. It exists. It's right here in front of you. You have a split of a second to either break it down by oxygen to produce acetyl-CoA and go into the mitochondria and enjoy every advantage possible from producing ATP with oxygen aerobically, right? Or you do not have oxygen on site or on time. If you do not immediately break it down with oxygen, an anaerobic enzyme is going to immediately connect it to 2 units of hydrogen. And when that happens, you get lactate. You get lactic acid, which we do not want for 2 reasons. 2 reasons, remember this. A, it can't go into the mitochondria. You're losing a lot of energy that you can produce. And B, now you have an acid. And the cell wants to conserve the hemostasis regarding pH. So by not being able to deliver oxygen to every pyruvate that has just been produced, you are losing major advantages. Not only that, now you have major disadvantages. So I would argue that aerobic fitness is the ability to supply high amounts of oxygen to pyruvates when they are produced or created. It's that simple. You either miss the train or you're on it. 2 options. It's black and white. By the way, it's as black and white as it gets in physiology or exercise physiology, which is a lot of times has a lot of gray areas. there are only two options here. And those two options are either you're going to have a lot of advantages or you're going to have a lot of disadvantages. There are no advantages of producing energy anaerobically besides high power. But if you look chemically, if you analyze it from an energetic standpoint, no advantages. Alright, so remember that, the pyruvat junction, and you'll see how many different things that we're going to learn are going to relate to that junction. Alright, slide 55. Okay, lipids and proteins, if you're breaking them down, have the potential of resulting in numerous amounts or numbers of pyruvat. Obviously, if you're going to break down a lipid or a protein, you better have enough oxygen. So that's why it's not going to happen dominantly before the cell has lots and lots of amounts of oxygen. If you are going to try and do that, which the body won't let you, but if theoretically you could force the cell to do that, you would be flooded with acid. So that's not a good idea, and it's basically not happening. So don't worry. Let's talk about glycogen versus glucose. Glucose is the building block of glycogen. The smallest glycogen unit is going to have about 1,000 units of glucose. The longest has about 50,000. So what the body does when it doesn't need the glucose is it connects it one to each other in a very long chain, so to speak, and then stores it as glycogen. The good thing about that is that bigger units tend to move less. They're not mobilized as easy as smaller units, so we don't want glucose moving around. I want to teach you something about glucose that is important, and it's a principle. Glucose is sugar. When you put sugar into a cup of water, it absorbs water, and a lot. So if you have glucose running around without a good reason, not utilizing it, it's going to absorb fluids. If you're absorbing fluids, you're messing with the body. That's not a good idea. That, for instance, that principle is utilized and is proven by the fact that we have only 5 grams of glucose that is free in the bloodstream. Only 5. You don't have 500. If you had half a kilo to 2 pounds, roughly. Sorry, about a pound, right? Sorry, my mistake. Of glucose in your bloodstream, your blood would be very viscous, and we're going to learn how bad that can be. So we want to limit the amount of glucose that is free. Thus, everything is stored as glycogen. When we need a lot of energy, glycogen is a good place to go to. You get immediately a lot of sugar, a lot of glucose, and in addition, when glucose is stored as glycogen, when you take it apart, it produces one more ATP than glucose that was not stored as glycogen. We won't go exactly into the reactions and the energetic balances that cause this, but remember that if you're breaking down a glucose that originates from glycogen, it's going to produce 3 ATPs per glucose net profit of energy of ATP versus 2 from a non-glycogen stored glucose. It's so basically, when you break down a glycogen, you get even the smallest glycogen, you're going to get 3,000 ATPs. Whereas if you break down 1,000 glucose units that were not stored as glycogen, you only get 2,000. So that's a bit inefficient, relatively one to each other. All right, slides 58, 59 are playing with the idea of the pyruvate junction. Obviously, you want to go to the right of the slide and enter the mitochondria. Afterwards, you can see the Krebs cycle. Basically, every acetyl-CoA that enters the Krebs cycle is going to produce an additional ATP unit that's additional to whatever you produce in the cytoplasm. We have a stream of hydrogens that is streamed to the respiratory cycle to help produce more ATP. And we have CO2, which is basically disposed to the plasma. Some of it stays there, some of it is going to be buffered, some is going to be disposed from the body by respiration. In the respiratory cycle, we have two major processes happening. We have the combination of hydrogens that are received from the Krebs cycle that connect naturally with oxygen that is received from the plasma, from the blood, at a ratio of 2 to 1, obviously, right? H2O, so 2 hydrogens on every oxygen to produce water. These waters, this water molecule will be termed as metabolic water because it's produced in a metabolic pathway. It's the same exactly like any other water. And the hydrogen ions are also used to activate a protein, an enzyme complex called ATP synthase, which I urge you to go online and write ATP synthase animation and see how it works. It's an amazingly simple idea that within, for every ion of hydrogen entered into the complex, 1 ATP is produced within 3 phases. And for every acetyl that entered the Krebs cycle, or the mitochondria I should say, we get plus 16 ATP. So in total, the total energy that is produced in the mitochondria can be at least 34 more ATPs besides what we got in the cytoplasm. If we're talking about breaking down a glucose that was never stored as glycogen, we get 2 ATP in the cytoplasm and now 34 in the mitochondria. That's together is 36. If it was stored as glycogen, that's already 37. Sometimes, for certain reasons, there are energetic gains within the respiratory cycle. An advantage is gained and an additional ATP is produced, so we sometimes see 38 ATPs produced. So what would you rather have? Breaking down a glucose anaerobically, you don't enter the mitochondria, you stay with 2 ATP units, or perhaps 3, or 36 to 38. I think that's an easy question to answer, right? It would be like asking, what allowance do you want this month? $2 or $3, or 36 or 38? If you've answered the first option, I don't want you as my student. Think about it. All right. So, what slide is this? Lost count. Never mind. This should be. You have all the metabolic pathways according to their dominance in exercise, from right to left, with all possible outcomes. I think it's ooh, you know what I've just noticed? One of the shakes has Hebrew in it. Okay, I'll upload I can't believe this. I'll upload an updated file. I apologize for that. I took it from a presentation that I used to teach with in Israel.